Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Good morning, Ishan.
It's a great
Yeah.
pleasure to have you here for this conversation. This is the most, what you call, exciting time, at least for the domestic population and a person of your expertise and reach. Obviously, I don't have a locus standi to talk about, even introduce the topic. That's not relevant. But just with your permission, if I would say, I'm not too sure whether the other geographies of this planet Earth, where there's so much of buzz around this annual exercise, and that is not to. I mean, you have every reason to feel offended because you're one of those few gentlemen in this country who wore all those important hats. Uh, I mean, shouldering the responsibility. In the space of economic policy making of this country. Uh, so all said and done, budget is budget, and uh, there's a, if not euphoria, at least the excitement level never fluctuates. I mean, it's always people are very excited about, and most of it obviously at an individual level they all refer to the taxation. But you, from a policy making side, obviously taxation is an important part of it, but there are several other things that you take into account. So if I quickly introduce the topic, that just for the benefit of the viewers, that is, as we prepare for the upcoming budget, obviously, all the eyes they closely watch this. They just look at the strategy to navigate the evolving macroeconomics landscape. While India continues to remain a bright spot, obviously with the GDP growth slowing, and particularly in the second quarter result, that has been a bit sobering, and coupled with inflation concerns and obviously the what do you call the fiscal deficit management and global uncertainty because of the geopolitical tension that has been ongoing in the West Asia and as well as the Russia and Ukraine thing. Policymaker obviously they face the challenges of sustaining the economic momentum while ensuring the financial stability. And this is again just for the viewers, sir. Obviously, this is something which you practice day in day out in your different role that you have done. So in this connection, if you take it further, probably just to contextualize, I think the key questions that arise on taxation to start with, and then of course the public spending, and followed by investment revival because the private investment is sluggish, and the structural reforms. The reforms have different connotation, different in over different decades. Depending on the regime that in charge, because the kind of subscription they have to the economic governance. But there is no option other than reform. So the moot question is, can the budget provide the necessary push for growth while maintaining fiscal discipline? And obviously, besides, we'll also touch upon the role of the central bank, uh, particularly in the context of the exchange rate volatility, as well as we just spoke about the private sector investment that will be crucial in shaping, the economic outlook of this country. This discussion also probably, if you are comfortable and provided your schedule permits, we will also explore the government's policy priorities, growth prospects, and the trade-off between the fiscal prudence and the economic stimulus in the upcoming budget. And I hope this all fits into a typical pre-budget, because the idea is to make best use of your time, sir. And obviously, whatever you feel carries less weightage, less relevance, or even otherwise it will be too generic, you are absolutely at liberty to drop them or deal with them the speed at which the depth at which you would wish, sir. It's a very freewheeling conversation. And very quickly to introduce you, I know that is a bit of silly thing to introduce Mr. Subbarao to anybody in this world, but still I do that. So we have our incisive speaker today. Dr. Subbarao is an Indian economist, and I do not know how he would like to be designated. Probably that is what will be the most relevant now. And the former civil servant who served as the 22nd governor of the Reserve Bank of India, that is between 2018 and 13. Why that period is relevant? That I think anybody who follows economy, so he or she will know what 2008 means for the financial and economic world. A 1972 batch IAS officer from undivided Andhra Pradesh cadre, and he has the distinction of claiming the top spot in the UPSC exam. That exam itself is so coveted, and he had the he enjoys the distinction of being number one. He previously served as the finance secretary of Government of India and was also a key figure in managing India's economic policies during 2008 global crisis. And then just moving on, so he also on the academic front, his scholarship journey is incredibly brilliant. He holds a degree from IIT Kanpur. Then he moves on to Ohio State University and the MIT Sloan School of Management. His tenure at the RBI was marked by a significant monetary policy challenges, including inflation control and financial sector reforms. So with this introduction, I know it is absolutely just for the sake of formality. There's nothing more. I don't know whether anybody really. I mean, is there anyone who doesn't know what Mr. Subbarao represents and his academic credentials and the professional accomplishments? Or I think as a country, this country remains grateful to not just your stewardship, both as the custodian of the Reserve Bank of India, even otherwise when part of the other side, that is I'm referring to the Treasury. Sir, very envious and incredible with an impeccable record, sir. We all are, I think, a grateful country would always remain grateful to you, and you will continue to inspire people in this country and the policymakers. So with this, with your permission, we will land in the discussion phase, and that's what people will be most interested rather than me introducing you and topic. We just move on, sir. I think post-COVID, the old world recognizes the India's recovery plan has been great, and you have been very vocal about it. And then you are, I won't say whether you're positivity in the strict legal term, but you are not someone who would, for the sake of running down something, so you have been, and you and many others who have gone on record saying that India's recovery has been incredibly brilliant. However, the economy slumped to a 7-quarter low. It was down to 5.4% in the second quarter. So, what is your view? What could be the real attributes, the causes for the slowdown, sir?
Well, thanks very much for the introduction to the topic and introduction to me. You've been very generous. To answer your question, the economy slowed, as you said, to a 7-quarter low of 5.4%. in the second quarter of this fiscal year, down from 6.7% in the first quarter. More importantly, when the NSO put out the number for the full year growth, they put it at 6.4%, which is down from 8.2% in FY24. So opinion is divided on whether the slowdown is cyclical or structural. Those who argue that the economy slowdown is cyclical say that it slowed down because government expenditure on infrastructure, public expenditure on capex has slowed down because of elections. Now that elections are behind us, that will pick up. Also, the global situation has been uncertain, which has had an impact on our export demand. Import prices had also gone up, but these will settle in the next few months. So we will get back to a high growth trajectory. We need not worry. In fact, the potential growth rate of the economy is 7% or 6.5%. The slowdown is just very temporary. Even the finance minister recorded this view. As opposed to this is the other view, which is that the slowdown is structural. This the rapid growth we saw over the last 3-4 years is because of the pickup from the COVID dip. So that catch-up growth is now exhausted. The growth that we saw has been driven almost entirely by government expenditure that is unsustainable. In order for the economy to get onto a sustainable high growth trajectory, it's got to fire on all cylinders, including private consumption, private investment, and net exports. And one indication of how the economy is performing is that even as the headline growth is 6.5 to 7%, consumption is only growing at 4%, to show that the benefits of growth are not percolating down. So I believe that the growth slowdown is more structural than cyclical, and we need to do a lot more to ensure that the benefits of growth are widely shared.
Thank you. I think it's a very comprehensive way you have set the tone for the remaining part of our conversation. So this takes me to the next issue that's quite an extension of what you just explained. So, in your view, sir, what can the top 2 or 3 things the budget do to revive growth? Not to be very specific and whatever you feel so the government should consider.
Yeah, sure. The priority for the budget is to put the economy on a high growth trajectory, accelerate growth rate, but that will not do. Mere growth will not do. As I said earlier, we need to ensure that the benefits of growth are widely shared. The reason I'm saying is this: consumption, private consumption, is the biggest growth driver of the Indian economy. It is the consumption of the bottom segments of the population that we've got to focus on. If their incomes grow, they will spend that money. That will spur consumption, which in turn will spur production and jobs, and we have the potential to get onto a high growth trajectory. So the top priority for the budget has to be, first, accelerate the growth rate, and then ensure that the benefits of growth are widely shared. The reason I'm saying this is that the old textbook economics used to be that you don't need to worry about growth trickling down. That would happen automatically. You just focus on generating growth. But now experience has shown that we need to generate growth and also have explicit policies to ensure that the benefits of growth are widely shared. So what can the budget do for this? The most important thing the budget can do is to implement structural reforms. This is the first full budget of the NDA-3 government. They've got 4.5 years ahead of them, and they've got enormous political capital left. So this is the opportune time to do politically difficult reforms which have the potential to put the economy in a high growth trajectory. And the agenda for those structural reforms is quite well known. The second thing the budget has to do is improve the investment climate. There's much talk about the US-China tensions accentuating. And if that happens, there is a window of opportunity for other emerging economies, particularly for India. We've been talking about China plus one for several years now, but this is a very critical moment for China plus one. So as potential investors look for that plus one, we've got to position ourselves as the plus one. So to do that, we've got to make investment in India happy and rewarding experience for investors. So we not only need to do structural reforms, but we need to implement reforms, governance reforms, to ease doing business in India. And as far as jobs are concerned, I think there's much need to focus on labor-intensive exports and the MSME sector. So those are some of the things that the budget must focus on.
Wonderful, sir. Wonderful. The last one, obviously, you touched upon very important pillars. Typically, every trained economist would like to look at it. The last one is something very, very, I mean, that is at least close to my heart, because I personally subscribe to the concept that while India continues to remain a domestic demand-driven economy, so I think all our economic policies must be designed keeping our labor force in mind, because there are strength. So there's no, I mean, while we cannot be averse to the technology advancement, and we must adapt all the what you call, nobody's against automation. It is no one's case, but at the same time, we simply can't brazen out. I mean, we should not care about whether we are branded as socialist in our mind when we think of economics. But I think this is something, the reality. It's not a myth for us, at least, and that's what we take pride in our population. So I think it is going very, very organically. The discussion is moving, because the next question that we thought we will take it up is Do you see, sir, there is room for cutting taxes, at least to revive consumption that you already alluded to in your briefing, and also to encourage investment?
Yeah. Yeah, the budget is a week from today, and there's been a lot of demand that the finance minister must cut taxes in order to generate or promote consumption and investment. That is standard supply side economics, which is that you cut taxes to trigger production and production and consumption. But I don't believe we have the luxury of doing that right now just because of the very difficult fiscal constraints. The government cannot afford to sacrifice revenue. Besides, I don't think a tax cut will be a long-term growth driver. It can be a temporary palliative, temporary relief, but in order to generate long-term growth, we need to do a lot of other things that we talked about, including difficult reforms. So first, because the government cannot afford it. Second, because it is at best a temporary palliative. I don't believe that there is a very strong case for tax cuts.
Absolutely, sir. Not to disagree, but if I may just, with your permission, I would share my thoughts. So one of the biggest charge, particularly emanating from in the middle of the pyramid, that we represent that segment which for us tax is non-reciprocal. Then we pay taxes, we don't get directly anything in return.
Yeah.
But I think the people who advocate or who believe in the government policies in particular, and since COVID time, that's almost 80 crore families are being given protection because we do not have a very formal social security that takes care of their basic needs. I think the underlying argument is, just to clarify my understanding, and please correct me, sir, I think the people with less earning, less fortune, so most of their earnings go to address their basic needs. So long as
Correct.
government is in a position to take care of that, at least in turn, so that money anyway they're not going to save, so the money is going to go back to the economy, and that in turn has a multiplier effect in the economy, and that's exactly so. Therefore, just to tell the 80 crore, I mean whatever that subsidy is, it's not a demerit subsidy. They're very much useful spend in that sense. That should not be confused with the anyway. In the latter part of the conversation, we are getting into those subsidies which are purely driven by electoral gain or whatever. But this is something which has a very, very genuine what do you call objective in government pushing that. So we move to a little more your hardcore fiscal discipline space. The center's fiscal deficit is likely to be on target of 4.9% of this year. So do you feel it is still a worry, or the situation has changed? So
No, I believe that it is too soon to declare victory. As you said, the finance minister is on track to deliver fiscal deficit of 4.9% this year and possibly 4.5% in FY26 next year, consistent with the glide path she set for herself. But I believe we are not out of the woods yet, because the most basic indicator of fiscal sustainability is the debt to GDP ratio. That ratio, debt to GDP ratio for India, states and center combined, is currently at about 18%. On the other hand, the FRBM target for debt to GDP is 60%. So current debt to GDP is significantly above that. So what is the consequence of a high debt? The most important consequence of a high debt is the interest payments on accumulated debt. Today, if you look at the central budget or the state budgets, the largest item of expenditure in any budget is the interest payments on the stock of debt. And the fastest growing item of expenditure is the interest payments on the stock of debt. And those interest payments are eating into other productive expenditure. So high fiscal deficits are vitiating the quality of expenditure. High fiscal deficits also fuel inflation, and they crowd out private investment. So for all these reasons, I believe that there's continued need to try and consolidate on the fiscal front and bring the debt to GDP ratio down. When I say this, I'm not talking just about the central government. I'm talking about the center and states combined. We must recognize, and most analysts and commentators don't recognize this adequately, which is that when we talk about the total fiscal picture, the states' importance is growing. Today, states collectively are as much of a player in the fiscal sector as the center. In fact, collectively they spend about 60% of the combined expenditure, where the center spends 40%. So the fiscal center of gravity is shifting from the center to states. So when we talk about the fiscal situation, we've got to look at both the center and states, and both of them have to consolidate. And there is, I believe, continued need for focus on fiscal consolidation, commitment to fiscal responsibility, and need to bring the debt to GDP ratio down to the FRBM target.
Absolutely. So this this encourages me to touch upon more of a reflection, two issue. One is FRBM Act. I think it has been a while since Jaswant Sinha, if I remember correctly, he presented it, and as we speak, I think Mr. N.K. Singh is still reviewing it. I do not know where it is. So what is your quick, how do you react to FRBM Act per se? That's number one, where you stand on that. And the number two is when you say, what do you call, the fiscal debt to GDP ratio, okay, debt to GDP ratio, and you always say that our public debt is high, which is hovering around 80%. At the same time, we also recognize the fact that it is much lower as compared to the advanced, to the developed countries like US, UK, Japan, even most of the EU countries, where somewhere it is in the range of 100 to 200%. And one important thing is that we do not have external borrowings, so it is. I mean we do have, but still government doesn't solely rely on the external borrowing. So all our borrowings are restricted to rupees. So how do you see this whole thing?
Yeah.
I mean, the interplay of what do you call the fiscal deficit and the FRBM, at the same time the economic stability?
There are two questions there. First is about the review of the FRBM and my view on the FRBM.
Yeah.
I believe the FRBM, or fiscal responsibility, that the center and states collectively agreed on, is a great positive force. It's been a force for the good. We've not achieved nirvana yet. We're not the best practice, but it has at least made us conscious of the need for fiscal rectitude and the commitment to fiscal responsibility. Of course, we strayed away from the path given by the FRBM target band, but at least we are more conscious of it now, and I think we should continue to remain committed. You said there's some review of the FRBM going on, but I believe that we must focus on not just fiscal deficits, but on the debt to GDP ratio as an end target. Also on revenue deficits, not just fiscal deficits, because revenue deficits mean that we are borrowing for current consumption. It is like a household borrowing for performing a marriage or a party or for vacationing, because the debt must pay for itself. So two things I want to say in the FRBM review: we must focus not just on fiscal deficits, we must focus on revenue deficits as well. Second, we must focus on debt to GDP ratio, and also that it is important for both the center and states collectively to consolidate on the fiscal front. Now, the second question about the debt to GDP ratios, international comparison, that is an important point, especially because a lot of people take a very misinformed view. It is true that 80% India's debt to GDP ratio is lower than that of many other countries, especially advanced countries, UK, the US, European countries, Japan. They all have debt to GDP ratio higher than 80%. In fact, Japan is about 250 to 300%. America is probably 150% or close to 200%. But those international comparisons are misleading, because our debt to GDP ratio is low, but we can get into a debt pressure or a debt trap, even at a lower debt to GDP ratio, because our revenue to GDP ratio is also low. So what is important is not just the debt to GDP ratio, but other conditions for debt sustainability, which is that we must have a primary surplus and that the growth rate must be higher than the average interest rate on the debt. All those conditions, I don't want to get into technicalities of textbook economics, but the point is that international comparisons saying that our debt to GDP ratio at 80% is safe compared to other countries which have it much above 80% is misleading.
Okay.
The second misperception is about the currency in which we borrow. It is true that the government, the sovereign in India, doesn't borrow in external currency except from official development agencies like the World Bank and the ADB. So the government's external debt is minimal. It borrows largely in rupees. But the more important point is that as an economy, we depend on foreign borrowing and foreign capital. So what matters is not just that the government is borrowing in rupees, but what matters is that as an economy, we depend on foreign borrowing. So to believe that the economy or the balance of payments or the external sector is safe because the government does not borrow in foreign currency is not very informed. It's a safety valve, but I believe that it is not a complete insurance.
Okay. So I think very brilliantly put up, sir. It's now quite clear. So just because you don't have external borrowing, that doesn't automatically make us immune against any investor. So that's clear. Now just as a reflection of my understanding and slightly gathered from my, the way I look at it in the context of budget, even states in our cooperative federal structure, where the states are also, the Constitution clearly provides that the states are not subordinate to center, so they're coordinates. All that stuff is fine, but at the same time, we have Niti Aayog, the powerful planning commission for the cooperative federalism. Then we have Finance Commission, Article 280 in the center, 240 in the state. They are also for the fiscal federalism. So now the point I have is it is more of a reflection rather than putting a question, and you can add your thoughts. Sir, often it has been seen for every good or bad thing around budget, around the economic, it is always the center, which is, at least from the optic side, I think the people have always held or pointed finger at the government, which is at the center, irrespective of the party in power. Whereas like you very clearly, you said even in your earlier part, even reforms, most of the reforms are actually moved by states. Because in our constitutional scheme of things, except money, that is the banking, that the sector that you represent, the finance, that alone rests with the center, rest all. Whatever you need for manufacturing, it's all for the state, whether it is land, it is materials, everything, even the people. So the point is, just to narrow down, the states, for whatever reason, traditionally has always been away from even the basic rigor of public scrutiny in this context. So in a way, don't you see that it only further normalizes that it is center which is the big brother than state? Only in the election they play the equality card, the states, but otherwise they also the states collectively, and it's not, we are not singling out any state, so they all take pride in that. They're fine that they're not held accountable. How many of us, in fact, obviously not a person of your category, a layman like me, obviously I may not be very keen for a state budget, the kind of interest I will have for the union budget. So yeah.
That is true. You made several points there. First, that in the overall fiscal picture, collectively states matter as much as the center, in fact more, because as I said before, the fiscal center of gravity is shifting towards them. Collectively, they spend more than the center. And as far as taxes are concerned, they collect as much as the center. So our overall fiscal stability and indeed our macroeconomic stability depends not just on the center showing fiscal rectitude, but also the states. So the first point is that commentators, analysts must look at states also as much as they look at the center. Second, it is true that the Constitution clearly lays down the taxation powers and expenditure responsibilities of the center and states. But there is a lot of transfer of resources that takes place from the center to states. Some of those resources are tied to specific end uses, but states are increasingly able to spend the money as they like. So the quality of expenditure at the state level is very important for our overall growth. The third point is about structural reforms. The reforms that we carried out starting 1991 over the last 3 decades have been largely in the domain of the central government. Now, they've been in the regime of for this delicensing, liberalization, public sector investment, opening up the financial sector. These are all topics in the domain of the center. But the second generation reforms that we're not talking about, reforms in the factor markets, land, labor, taxation, etc., they need not just the consent, but the active cooperation and involvement of the states. So the second generation structural reforms that we now have to carry out need center-state cooperation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Sir, at this stage, I have to make a request to you, sir. So we need to move to another link. There's a bit of inconvenience. So I'm just sending that. So I'm pausing you for a second here. We will resume the conversation, sir.
Do I need to log in again?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So can you, is the connection fine, sir?
Yeah, connection is fine from my side. What about you?
Yes, sir. Perfectly fine, sir. Thank you so much, sir. So this takes us to the next fear, because they say there are two things. One is good economics and good politics can coexist. Sometimes they don't, but the issue is we were slightly shifting the gear, sir. This is a country which till 1970, probably the elections both in the center and state were in tandem for some reason, mostly, of course, the politically driven. So that had to split. Now again, that debate is back, and as we speak here, that one nation, one poll is under the, before the Honorable Parliament. So there are laws being made, there are support, there are opposition, all that is fine. Why, how that is context? Because in economics cannot be separated from the politics. That's a very, very common notion. So now what happens when every year, one or two states, a couple of states, they go into election. So obviously, unlike the developed countries, our policy continuity is not very automatic, right? In that sense, what happens is, and slowly because it's a very fractured, very fragmented political industry, if I may say so. There is always the inherent competition among the parties, how to sort of attract the voters towards them. So one of the quickest or easiest thing has been found is in this populist freebies, which lack merits. So in that context, and everybody understands, every sensitive citizen, one has to be incredibly incensed to say that this doesn't harm our long-term growth. So we would like to share, hear your thoughts on how this competitive populism on freebies, basically the subsidies which do nothing other than just a very, very temporary gratification of people just to vote in their favor, especially at a state level, because that is what we see often, because the central election happens once, whereas there are many states going to elections. So therefore, in the unit level, they are more felt, and so will this hurt our long-term growth, sir?
It will, I believe, in the current situation, the way this competitive populism is going on. If it continues like this, it'll be fiscally very burdensome, and it can hurt our long-term growth prospects. As you said, this is politically driven. Politicians offer what are colloquially called freebies or transfer payments in order to gain votes or to get into vote bank politics. We saw that in Maharashtra election 3 months ago. We're seeing that ahead of the Delhi election today. But the point is, first on the political side, if every party is offering freebies, they probably neutralize each other, no party benefits. And people are anyway seeing through all this, because I heard some people say on the TV, some public, when they interviewed on the TV, say that what's the point of all this freebie, because it is only fueling inflation. So net, we're no better off. So on the political side, I'm not sure that it's paying off. But on the economic front, it's imposing a huge fiscal cost. And all political parties are guilty of this, including the BJP. I believe all governments are guilty of this, the central government and all state governments. So there is need to rein in fiscal, this freebies in order to protect our long-term growth prospects. As you said, in a country like ours, where millions struggle for a decent livelihood every day, some transfer payments from the government are necessary. They're indeed desirable, but they've got to be limited, restrained, especially because these so-called freebies are being financed by borrowing. So the need for restraint in order for our fiscal sector to be safe. So I believe there is a strong case for the center and states to collectively agree on a code of conduct, because these freebies will not get us very far, will not get people very far. As Mao said, instead of giving a man a fish every day, teach him to fish. If you give him a fish every day, you're taking care of him for that day. But if you teach him to fish, you're taking care of him for a lifetime. So that's what we must be focusing on. And there must be a political consensus on a code of conduct on freebies. And I believe the central government must take the initiative on this. Just as we've done on FRBM, just as we've done on GST, this is another issue that is crying out for center-state cooperation.
Thank you, sir. I think it's a very, very balanced response, and I think sometimes it is a bit provocative to see the way the public exchequer is being used for such things. But this also reminds us, while primarily it is the political parties who need to be held accountable, but we have seen the people in advisory role, not in electoral politics also. They also had their bit of contribution to it. And just to put a perspective, in 1969, when the bank nationalism was happening, I think Mr. D.R. Gadgil, who used to be the Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission, the entire loan mela concept was it is reported that he was advising Mrs. Gandhi government that loan mela could be a wonderful avenue for us to put money into people's pockets. So obviously, when you say loan mela, there's a tacit they're holding an invitation people to take money without any intention to repay.
Right.
But at the same time, like you said, in our country is very different. We cannot completely replicate the playbook of other countries. We're a very different country where major part of our people are vulnerable section, so we can't be complete. So any such thing has its own, not just emotional, even otherwise, it has a very, very practical fallout on the way these lives have to be maintained. So any government is not going to be very easy. But once you you rightly say it has to be a collective decision, so that as a country we just imbibe that culture of doing it very diligently, only on a need basis, not just the way it is done today with a sense of irresponsibility.
Yeah.
Fair enough, sir. Thank you. I think it's a sensitive topic, but otherwise it was important that this makes a hole in our whole system. So moving into let's move from your North Block role to the Mint Road, from Delhi to Bombay. So RBI, what can our central bank, you think, should be doing to revive growth? Because it's a major stakeholder, the way the economy is run.
Yeah.
And just to add on, will a rate cut in Feb, which is upcoming, that would help so.
The most important thing that any central bank, including the Reserve Bank of India, can do to support growth is to control inflation. Because evidence from around the world, including in India, shows that low and steady inflation is a necessary condition for growth. So inflation today is above the midpoint range. It's been moving in and out of the target band. So the most important thing RBI has to do is to bring inflation down to the central point of the target band, which is 4%. Because when inflation is down, people can make informed decisions on investment and consumption that actually promotes growth. But on the other hand, very high inflation can destabilize inflation expectations and hurt growth. RBI research has in fact shown that low inflation, something like below 3.5% is actually positive for growth. But when inflation goes beyond 3.5 to 4%, it starts hurting growth. When inflation goes above 6%, it positively is corrosive for growth. So the most important thing the central bank can do is to bring inflation down. There are some people who argue, as indeed they're arguing today, that a rate cut is very important in order to generate investment, etc. But I don't believe that is the most important thing. The binding constraint for investment today is not the interest rate. In fact, the real interest rate is indeed quite low. So binding constraint for investment is that there is no demand for investment because there is no consumption. So to believe that the RBI must cut rates to support growth, I think is misinformed. The most important thing the RBI can do to support growth is to maintain price stability.
True, sir. And
I also want to add that the tension that people see between growth and inflation, there is no tension in the medium to long term. The tension, if any, is only in the very short term.
Right, sir. I think very, very, very appropriately you have put this point. And just to pick up the investment thing that I think in earlier part of your the briefing you touched upon, and this has a direct nexus. So private investment in our country has been sluggish, and there's a view that this is because of the tight monetary policy that has been rolled out by the bank in recently. So how do you look at it?
Yeah. I had already alluded to that point. A lot of people believe that investment today is sluggish because the interest rates are high. RBI is maintaining a tight policy regime, and therefore that is inimical to investment. That view is misinformed because investors go by the real interest rate. And the real interest rate today is quite low, so that is not the binding constraint. Also, investors take a decision on their long-term investment, not based on the interest rate in the short term, but interest rate over several cycles. So it's not the interest rate that is the binding constraint for investment today. The binding constraint is lack of demand. And when demand picks up, I believe investment will pick up.
Fine. So I think that is what most of us would believe in, because just one as a corollary to this, if as a country increasingly we believe, and particularly after 91, that we want to open up and the government control cannot be continued with the flavor. That's all fine, and that is where one of the tangible benefit that has been experienced is millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. That's one of the best things that could have happened, and the reforms that we all opened up. But just as the other side of the coin is, if as a country, and at the same time, we also, the disclaimer is important. We don't call ourselves as a out and out capitalist model that what is seen in the West. So now the discussion is not capitalist versus socialist, but as a country, are we doing enough to recognize or are we needlessly targeting the business community? And I'm not referring to any specific incident, just at a very, very at a more at a very macro level, what is our philosophical, what do you say, thought process towards how do we see the community that creates wealth, and I'm referring to the value creators because and where I'm coming from, often as a country we have been very confused the way we treat our as if any I mean, by default, the industrialist, they're here to exploit, and
Right.
while we all know that profit maximization, value maximization, these might be lingos which are used to justify different things, but they are here to create values, and there is and whether we like it or not, there is a default underlying element of profit. So they're not here for charity. But at the same time, do we tend to ignore all the common good that is delivered through the whole process, or how it is? Because that is where I think there's a deficit of trust. How do they trust us as a
Yeah.
country as well? So that is what, if you will, relevant to address.
No, I think you explained that issue very well. In India, I think we should change our stereotype view of wealth creators. We need wealth creators because as much as they create wealth not for themselves, but for the entire country. There is a lot of externality because they generate jobs, they generate economic activity. So we should not shun wealth creation as long as it is done under law, conforming to the rule of law and to the economic regulations and according to a good code of conduct. So wealth creators are needed, are necessary, and will continue to be necessary. And as Adam Smith said, it is the pursuit of selfishness of every individual that collectively contributes to common good. So if wealth creators generate profit for themselves, we must understand that there is a spillover impact, wider spillover impact in terms of creating jobs and economic activity. But that wealth creation should be within the perimeters of law, within the perimeters of the rule of law, within the perimeters of what is just and proper.
Absolutely true. So true, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. We just come towards as we approach towards the end of our conversation. So there are a couple of more issues we wanted to take your insights. The economic survey of 23-24 that pitched for an inflation targeting framework that targets an inflation rate excluding food. And that's the way we have been traditionally looking at this data point. So how do you see it in the current context?
I do not agree with the argument made in the economic survey that the MPC must target food, core inflation after knocking out food from the headline inflation. The reason is this, that food constitutes a large segment, a big segment of India's consumption basket. It is food prices that people experience on a daily basis. It is food prices that shape inflation expectations. For the MPC and for the RBI to target an esoteric variable that people don't relate to, there's a risk that they will lose credibility. The argument that food must be knocked out of the inflation targeting regime is made on the basis that food demand is inelastic. Monetary policy impacts inflation from the demand side. Therefore, monetary policy is an ineffective instrument for fighting inflation when it is driven by food prices. I think that argument will be acceptable if food inflation is a one-off, but not acceptable if food inflation has become a trend, as in our case. So as some RBI report, I believe, has said, that the food inflation is our new core inflation. So I don't think it'll be appropriate for the MPC to target core inflation. I think they must continue to target headline inflation that people relate to. However, I must say that there is a case for reviewing the consumption basket. Some people have said that the consumption basket has changed, the proportion of food has come down. There's a case for reviewing that.
Great, sir. Great. I think thank you. It's a very what do you call very incisive response to a very touchy topic because it's part. I mean, it's uh, while RBI does what it thinks it's prudent, but at the same time, food is such a thing like very what do you call brilliantly that you articulated what it means in a once uh, mm, daily budget and particularly it impacts the people who form the majority of our demography. So therefore, it's very important that we must have a policy design which in response or sensitive to that part of it. So now it brings us to near end of the conversation and now we come to the most interesting aspect that's about the rupee, the Indian rupee, and not to make any, I mean, not to attribute any contentious character to the topic, but the uh, Indian rupee has weakened to a very, I mean, low level. So in your view, as the you have been the man in charge of the Reserve Bank of India in the one of the most crucial and difficult time, and you obviously were successful in selling through and protecting this, guiding this institution and the economy in general. I mean, viewers must know who are uninitiated with your role with I mean your stint in RBI. That was a very difficult phase I mean the world was going through. So in your view, sir, should RBI allow the rupee to find its own level, or there is a room for it to intervene, sir, just to bring a stability to this thing because it cannot be unfettered. It cannot go on forever that rupee continues to slide.
I think the RBI should allow the rupee to track fundamentals. And it's, as you mentioned, it's weakened in the last 2 to 3 months. I think that's quite appropriate because it is tracking fundamentals. If inflation reflects the domestic price of the rupee, the domestic price of the rupee is falling, the external price also has to fall, the rupee has to weaken. Today, if you look at the real effective exchange rate, the real exchange rate, rupee is overvalued in real terms, which suggests that there's a case for further weakening. And I believe that the RBI must allow that to happen because if we prop up the rupee artificially, it hurts exports and it hurts growth. On the other hand, I admit that allowing the rupee to weaken will be inflationary, but inflation can be taken care of by monetary policy. So on balance, I believe the balance of advantage will lie for the RBI to allow the rupee to track fundamentals. Of course, RBI must engineer the trajectory of decline in order to prevent volatility, but should not prevent the decline itself if that's what economic fundamentals are saying. Especially in today's situation when the dollar is likely to remain strong, it'll be difficult for the RBI to continually prop up the rupee. So I think it'll be appropriate for the RBI to walk the talk. Its policy is not to target any specific exchange rate, but to prevent volatility, and that's what it should do.
Very good. Very good. So I think with this our conversation we can bring it to a closer. But before we wrap up and leave our closing remarks, the last thing if you could consider to entertain what as a person, not Subbarao wearing the hat of finance secretary or the RBI ex-RBI governor, but as a very sensitive, socially sensitive citizen, which he is. So what are the few things government may consider, you think, not necessarily through budget, because budget, as we said in the beginning, there's nothing to be so excited about any budget. It is nothing against anything, but the budget is just a plan thing, not to
Yes.
underplay the significance. So what are the things I think we as a country should focus on, sir, if we want to pursue our aspiration?
Well, we're focusing on growth. I don't want to undermine the focus on growth. Of course, we must ensure that the economy gets onto a high growth trajectory, continues to grow fast at 7.5% or whatever. In fact, if you got to get to developed country by 2047, the centenary of independence, we need to go, I believe, at 7.6% on a trot for the next 22 to 23 years. So we must continue to focus on growth, but that is not sufficient. We need to focus on reducing inequalities. As we talked about earlier in this conversation, accelerating growth is important, but equally important is to ensure that the benefits of growth are widely shared. The rising tide lifts all the boats, but it should not lift some boats more than the others. We must see that the rising tide lifts all the boats, and there got to be explicit policies for that. And those explicit policies must focus on creating productive jobs, because unemployment or underemployment is one of the major challenges in the economy today.
Thank you. Thank you. I think just picking up your last point, I think when you spoke on skilling, I think credentialism is another dampener. We might distribute degrees, but whether our people are employable or not, maybe that's a narrative for another day. I think we will have another occasion to dwell on it in details, and it will be really interesting to hear your thoughts, sir. And as we wrap up this discussion, I think it's clear that the upcoming Indian budget will play a very crucial role in shaping India's economic trajectory. And like what we draw from this conversation is the balancing growth, fiscal discipline, and investment revival, which is an important pillar, and inflation management, which you dwelt on in great details. So will require well-calibrated policies. And at the same time, we're also cognizant of the challenges such as slowing GDP, where we are not trying to paint all the good works in a bad color, but at the same time, we can't shy away from flagging off if something is not not in desired this thing, and a widening fiscal deficit. And of course, the global uncertainties that continues to persist, and this is not something which we're in control of, but then we are definitely impacted. But at the same time, this has a direct bearing on the way we design our policies. But at the end, we have to take charge of ourselves, like you rightly said. Just because I don't have external borrowing, that doesn't mean that just because my borrowings are in rupees, so we are immune. And there are also opportunities, I think, to drive structural reforms. You just spoke about just to ensure the long-term economic resilience, because adverse factors are not always are under our mitigation plan. So, but at the same time, what we can do is we can build capability to be resilient and agile to respond to that. So the path ahead calls for if I have to summarize, it needs a pragmatic approach. It's a midway. There's always a third set that takes center stage, so that and that way should foster growth, strengthens investors' confidence, and ensures fiscal stability. It will also be interesting to see how the government address these pressing concern in the upcoming budget that we all are looking forward to. And with this, sir, we sort of end this conversation, and it has been a very, very insightful session with you, sir, and really appreciate you to join us for this important conversation. It has been very, very educational as always. Listening to you has always been a pleasure, and I hope our viewers enjoy and they go far more enriched with your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.